Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, Professor of Brazilian History and Culture at Brown University and the National Co-Coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is part of the Democracy Observatory and is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the great pleasure of welcoming a friend of many years, Edward MacRae. He is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Anthropology from the Federal University of Bahia. He did graduate work at the State University of Campinas and received a doctorate at the University of São Paulo. His dissertation, The Construction of Equality, Sexual Identity and Politics in Brazil During the Opening, which is my translation of the original, A Construção da Igualdade, Identidade Sexual e Política no Brasil da Abertura, was published by the publishing house at Unicamp in 1990 and republished in 2018. And it's really considered one of the founding classics of LGBTQIA plus studies in Brazil. Edward has also written extensively on public policy regarding drugs and harm reduction, on ayahuasca, Santo Daime, and other related topics. So, Edward, we're invited you today in part to celebrate the LGBTQIA plus movement, Pride Month, and related activities. We want to really warmly welcome you to Brazil Unfiltered.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Well, I'm Brazilian born. My father was Scottish and my mother Brazilian. And when I was a teenager, I was sent over to school in Britain. And I went to school in Scotland originally, then in England, and I went to Sussex University. And then later on, I did a master's degree in sociology of Latin America at Essex University. And then I came back to Brazil and spent many years as teaching English as a foreign language here. And then after these many years, I decided to go back to university, and I started another master's degree at the State University of Campinas. And then as I already had a master's degree from England, when I got that to be finally recognized, I then moved over to the State University of São Paulo, where I ended my research and I wrote my thesis as a PhD thesis. So it's all rather complicated, but it doesn't really matter very much. And so I really, my education was in England, and that's why I have a strong British accent. But then I came back to Brazil, and I've been living here for many, many years, and I feel much more Brazilian than anything else. I've got dual nationality. And during this period that I was in Britain, I was there during the 60s. I arrived in Britain in 1960, and I finally left Britain, came back to Brazil for good in 72. So I was able to, and I was at Sussex University and then at Essex, which were both sort of fairly, they had sort of radical students there. Some were radical, and some of the other professors and so as well. So I was able to live through all these, the 60s, and I spent some time, just a couple of months, in the United States in 1967, when I was very interested in all the flower power, all these questionings of gender roles as well, and of drug use and so on. And I made sure I went to San Francisco, and I visited the Haight-Ashbury, and I was very interested in what was happening. And then, when I started my MA, my master's degree at Essex University, I shared a house with one of the first sort of feminists of this new feminist wave that sort of reached Britain around the end of the 60s. And my house was one of the places where feminism was being specially discussed in the late 60s and early 70s. So I was able to follow these discussions, and I was very interested because I myself had a whole lot of issues about gender roles, and because I hadn't really come out as gay, but I had these strong feelings and questionings and so on. And so I was very interested in the sort of women's liberation discussions. And then just around 69 or 70, the gay liberation started in London. I was living about an hour from London by train. And I used to go to some meetings and some demonstrations in London, but I was never really very closely involved with the organization of the gay liberation movement in London, because, as I say, it was in London and I was living in Colchester, which was some way away. And then things were just beginning at the time. Then I came back to Brazil, and I had, I brought these ideas with me. And I also started, just last few months, I was in England in 1972, I think. I came out, and then, I came out to myself, actually. I didn't come out so generally. And I came back to Brazil. Brazil was then under the rule of President Médici, who possibly, I mean, all the military presidents were pretty awful, but Médici might be considered the worst of the lot for all the torture and so on that went on at the time,
So
And
before you continue the story of your arrival in Brazil, let me just make a comment, and maybe we can reflect. It's very interesting. I actually never knew this part of your story very clearly. And you and I live parallel lives in the sense that precisely at the same time that you were coming out and getting involved in the gay movement in England, or getting in touch with it, I was also going through the same process in the United States. Both of us leave our home countries, or our country in your case that you've lived in for many years, and go to Brazil precisely at a moment during the dictatorship. So what was it like as a recently out gay man coming back to Brazil during a very conservative period, and experiencing the political situation in Brazil as well as the personal situation?
Well, it was very sort of frustrating, or maybe anguishing, because it really was a rough period. And I had been away from Brazil for a long time. My family is a sort of upper middle class family. And at home, we spoke English. And I had this British education. So I was very much sort of out of touch in Brazil. And I spent some time sort of trying to understand Brazil and trying to sort of find a place for myself in Brazil. I think that is possibly why I ended up becoming an anthropologist. It's a sort of an effort for my own to find my way in Brazil and understand what Brazil was about. I had done a master's degree on sociology of Latin America. But I had studied little Brazil. I studied more about Argentina and Peru at the time. And all I did was the thing, what I kept reading about Brazil was a Brazil that I didn't really know from my own personal family experience. So there was a whole period of time when I was sort of trying to adapt and find a space for myself. And this was the worst period of Brazilian history, or one of the worst periods of Brazilian history. And one of the ways I tried to sort of adapt was attending courses at the State University of São Paulo. And I spent 2 years doing a course in communications and television and radio. And as you know, the State University of São Paulo is considered one of the best in Brazil, and is very good, and they're very interesting people studying and teaching there and so on. However, I was very disappointed. I was at this School of Communications, which was considered one of the sort of trendier and sort of more upfront sort of places at the university. And my fellow students were so conservative. No one wanted to discuss politics. I remember, I mean, this is something that people in Brazil sometimes forget, that at the time, I was, I'd studied sociology of Latin America. I'd been particularly interested in the dictatorship in Brazil and so on. And I remember I was shocked when my fellow students, they used to make fun of people who went out sort of saying, abaixo a ditadura, down with the dictatorship. It was just considered a sort of silly thing to say, or I don't know. It was a time when you had these radical guerrilla fighters, like among other people, Dilma Rousseff, but they were small groups, and they didn't really make that much impact, even at this important university in São Paulo. And I really was rather shocked by that, and very apolitical sort of position. Maybe if I'd gone to study at the sociology school, then it might have been different. But
this was at the University of São Paulo, USP, or
USP at the Comunicações, at the
ECA, School of Education. Yeah, so it's very interesting because you were there from 72 to 74. Is that right?
Yeah, around there. Mm-hmm.
Because it's very interesting. In 74, 75, you see new student groups get involved and get organized, and actually they'll carry out a strike at this school in 75 and be a very important part of the mobilizations of students against the dictatorship.
Yeah, I'd already left the university at that time.
So you kind of missed
because
this.
I missed this period. And then I spent much of my time teaching English at the British Council School in São Paulo, and I had private students who could afford to pay what I charged. So it was all I was in a very middle class or upper middle class setting. Till I really, then I came out, and I soon got into a sort of pretty sort of steady relationship, and I with a friend of mine who had a lot of friends who were involved with the theatrical scene in Brazil, which just before this period, this had been one of the most radical one of the more radical sort of sets of people, I don't know, in São Paulo, questioning the government, questioning, sort of denouncing torture and so on, so on, so on. But I think, as you know very well, there was this period of sort of guerrilla fighting in the late 60s and early 70s in Brazil. And then the military sort of managed to sort of kill everyone off or imprison everyone or exile everyone. And from, I don't know, you'll probably be able to tell me better the period, but it's about 74 onwards, still about 76 or so. There was, very little sort of going on the surface. What happened then is that let's say the younger brother, this guerrilla movement was very much a middle-class student affair. And when all these guerrillas were killed or imprisoned or exiled, their younger brothers, let's say,
and sisters,
they came, but it was mainly their brothers, because the women were off in exile. So what I'm going to say is that there was a whole lot of this on a cultural level. There was a lot of questioning and so on, and in terms of theater, music, I think obviously the women were included there, but it was a strongly masculine thing. When I think it was 75, there was the beginning of a movement for amnesty for the exiles. Then a whole lot of people who had been exiled and been off in Europe and the United States, and who had lived through all this women's liberation and gay liberation, these movements, then they came back, and that is when the women's liberation movement in Brazil, or the feminist movement in Brazil, really took off, as I see it. I mean, there was a sort of there were, let's say, two wings. Let's say there were those who were more associated with the sort of classical working class struggles and political parties and the remnants of these guerrillas on one hand, and then there were these people who came over with these new ideas from Europe with more, let's say, existential questions, as they were seen at the time, and this is when the sort of there began to be more questioning of gender roles and so on, including in the left. That's when the women said, we're fed up with preparing coffee and typing and so on, and we want to have a say. This is a very interesting period from 75 onwards, and a whole lot of questioning came up in the sort of broader left wing and part of society. That's PT, the Workers' Party, began to be organized. You had the Convergência Socialista, which was probably, I think, the first openly political organization, really left-wing political organization to appear, which after a short while became a sort of a Trotskyist group. And then at that time, I began to feel I wanted to go back to university. I was fed up with just teaching English. I got bored with that. And then I went back. Then that's when I went to the State University of Campinas and started a new master's degree there, because I'd done a master's degree in England, but it was a long time before, and I'd done it in England. and I didn't really feel it. I didn't really feel very confident about my knowledge of Brazil and so on. Then I spent some time at the State University of Campinas, and there I decided that I want to study the gay movement that was just beginning. I had as my supervisor British anthropologist Peter Fry, who was just we became very good personal friends. And at the time when he began supervising me, I think it was about 78 or so, that is when he, among other handful of journalists and intellectuals, started a newspaper, a gay newspaper. It wasn't a gay, sort of strictly didn't call itself as a gay paper, but as something for the minorities, which included women, blacks, and Indians, and a bit of discussion on environment. But really, everyone really was interested in discussing gay issues.
And the title of the
Lampião.
newspaper was Lampião, right?
Lampião, yes. And it was difficult. It was at the time, it was difficult to discuss gay issues openly. There was still a very taboo subject, either on one hand, for moral reasons, or on the other hand, it was, the more left-wing people thought it wasn't really very important. What one had discussed was sort of organizing the working class and trade unions and so on and so on. And but after a few months, Lampião became absolutely became its main and maybe only subject was sort of gay issues, really. And but it started off as minorities.
You're using the term gay here to infer gay men, but did Lampião also include women in its coverage?
Very little initially. I mean, these were gay men who started it. But as right from the beginning, they wanted to sort of broaden their approach. But they had great difficulty in finding people who were not gays to join them because they were so obviously gay. I mean, this was a really taboo thing. And they had difficulty getting women to talk about lesbian issues. After some time, they finally were able to include women, but always in a sort of there were one or two issues which were specially devoted to lesbian questions. But on the whole, this was a gay paper, and something which Brazil needed, because Lampião showed the whole of Brazil, because for a series of fortuitous reasons, Lampião was able to have a very, very good distribution all over Brazil. And at the time, Brazil was very provincial, and things happen in Rio, things happen in São Paulo, and everywhere, all the rest of Brazil was sort of as if it was forgotten. And Lampião was able to bring attention to the gay ghetto in Rio and in São Paulo. And things that were very secretive till then became public. I didn't know anything about the sort of gay ghetto in Rio at the time, for instance, and relatively little about São Paulo. I knew friends of mine and what some friends of mine did and where some friends of mine went and where some friends of mine met, but I didn't have a broader picture. So Lampião was very important in highlighting these activities and showing them to the whole of Brazil. And at the same time as Lampião was begun, then some members of the editorial board decided to start a gay liberation movement, and then so the beginning of Lampião gave sort of also highlighted what this movement was doing in the beginning.
So you joined, you jumped in and you joined a group which eventually would be called Somos, Grupo de Afirmação Homossexual. We Are, which would be the translation, group of homosexual affirmation. I also was a part of that group. I think we met in a meeting of Somos.
I think we joined roughly at the same time.
Right.
So Somos already existed. I mean, I went but it was just beginning, and it exploded. It was amazing. You know, there was this example from São Paulo and from Rio. Was sort of divulged all over Brazil by Lampião, and then you started having all these gay liberation groups starting off in many different parts of Brazil, kind of following the example given by Lampião. And it was all very, very quick. It's as if you had something, something was simmering there and waiting to explode. It was it was a matter of weeks or months. It just suddenly mushroomed, It was quite interesting. And then women started joining, and the whole movement. After a short while, the women in this group began to feel that they had their own issues and that they'd better sort of organize themselves and so on. This is when at the same everything was happening. It was a horrible place because of this dictatorship, but it was also very interesting because I think compared to today, it was more interesting. The thing, because everything seemed to be happening all of a sudden, and at the same time you had these gay men and lesbians beginning to appear and talk. You also had the feminist movement was growing, and then these lesbians who had been part of Somos and then started their own group, they began interacting with the straight lesbian groups and bringing these discussions about sexuality and sisterhood and all kinds of things like that to the feminist movement. So it was a sort of cross-fertilization, which was very interesting. Very.
Edward, what would be, if you could look back at that? So you are doing graduate work, and I think Peter Fry and you decided it would be interesting for you to study Somos. So you will become what anthropologists call an observer participant within the organization, accompanying it, taking notes in meetings. I remember there was a kind of an internal battle. There were some people who were against you being there, and I thought it was great at the time that someone would be actually documenting what we were doing. Someone was actually taking good notes of the meetings. But what were the highlights for you of those 2 or 3 years between 1978 and 1980 when you were in Somos. What were the most memorable moments for you in terms of their impact on Brazilian society?
Well, there were many memorable moments. The whole thing was memorable because for personal reasons, a whole lot of people, it was an experience, kind of conversion experience. It's almost, I mean, one of the members once compared it to a religious experience, in a way, to a religious conversion, and so there was this, people kept coming, there were meetings sort of just about sort of every day, because people wanted to meet and they wanted to be together, and then they created a space where they could be out and when they could meet other people who were out and learn from other people. So there was this very exciting, it was very exciting to be part of Somos, and to go out, and people who had been sort of covered, and then they suddenly find other people to back them, and then they come out in public and they speak in public, and all this business of coming out in public was very memorable, was very important. At the time, I had this experience in Britain, and when I was at university in Britain, I was involved with all kinds of student movements in Britain, and then there was a famous event at Essex University where I was directly involved, where there was a sit-in. When the whole idea of sit-ins began, there was a sit-in, I don't know where, in San Francisco or something, and then there was another one immediately at Sussex, and then there was a sit-in, and everyone refused to go to classes and so on, and the American government sent a representative to talk about the war in Vietnam, because that was a great question at the time. And then one of the members of this group I belonged to, and I was just next to him, just about, threw a whole bucket of red paint on this American representative. And then there was a scandal and so on, because British politics is very tepid in a way. These things didn't really happen at the time very much. And but anyway, I had come from this background of not socialist, anarchist kind of organizations and view of politics and so on. And that's when I went to the University of São Paulo, I missed this more radical view. I mean, that's very different from the students I knew in England. And so I always had, even when I was in Somos, I harked back to my experience in Britain, and more political in a sort of left-wing way, and because Somos was very much sort of arranged in a sort of a kind of I don't know, anarchist sort of approach, and there was great concern not to become too involved with party politics, because all party politics was seen as homophobic, and people thought that all the working class was homophobic, and that no one was interested in gay issues, and there'd been this kind of rejection of left-wing politics. And I felt that I didn't agree with that. I think that's probably why we kind of sort of hit it off together and became friends, because we had similar ideas, although I wasn't as organized as you were politically. But anyway, so there was all this question. There were these people most people had, let's say, existential questions and gender questions. And there was a great suspicion of more sort of left-wing organized politics. So anyway, so that then there began to be organization. Then there were at the moment, I can't remember exactly, but there were a whole series of meetings on trying to be on a more national level. And these were very important at the time. I couldn't really just at the moment.
There's a couple of moments in the early history of the movement which have become iconic. One is the participation of Somos in a demonstration of the Black United Movement in downtown Sao Paulo. Another is 50 gays and lesbians going to the May Day demonstration during the general strike. And the third, I think, big one is mobilization against police repression in 1980. So 79 to 80 became kind of intense years within the movement in Sao Paulo, responding to the other social movements and political movements that were emerging in Brazil in this time period. So do you have any memories of those?
I'm very proud. I'm very proud to have taken part with Somos in the second Black, I don't know what you call the Movimento Negro Unificado, the unified Black movement, so demonstration, which was something that we were put in touch with them via our contacts with the Convergência Socialista. And to this day, I'm proud of that, because it was a very important thing for the Black movement. And we were there, and we were very well. There's always this fear that the organized movements in general, those who were not gay movements or lesbian movements or feminist movements, even the feminist people were rather worried about. That we'd be we wouldn't be taken seriously, or we wouldn't be accepted or something. And this Black movement was the first time we went out with banners and in the center of Sao Paulo, and that was a great time. The other one was this there's a long story, but then there was this period when there was a strike, a very important strike in steelworkers strike, and again some members of Somos took part, and this caused havoc in the Somos and led to a series of splits. Unfortunately, I was down with hepatitis at the time, and I couldn't go to the manifestation with the workers, where Lula was there and so on. But my heart was with the people who went there.
In fact, I remember we had a meeting in your brother's house, which was under construction at the time, Alan, to decide whether or not to participate. I think you were at that meeting. Maybe not.
I think I was. I had this hepatitis just shortly before the meeting, the big sort of strike sort of event. But anyway, so that was a very important thing. And then it was very important, and it led to the split in the movement. Before that, there had been a series of meetings of the feminist meetings, when these conflicts came out among the women, between those who were more sort of the sort of classical left-wing organizations and these women who had these more modern feminist ideas. There were a whole lot of conflicts and so on at the time. And the women in Somos, some women remained in Somos, but Somos was also quite close to the women who had broken off to start their own group. And we also took part in these events organized by the women, sort of helping look after the children while the women went off to discuss things and so on. But we gave some kind of support. And that was also, things were very exciting at the time. Everything was happening right under the noses of the military.
So this is a perfect segue into a final question, a segment of this program, in which I'd like to talk a little bit about comparing the past to the present. We were together at the Pride Parade in São Paulo on one of the sound trucks, observing, the immense numbers of people in the millions who were parading through São Paulo at a moment in which the government in power is extremely homophobic, misogynist, racist, against the environment. What is your experience as a person who was a founder among the founding people of the original movement? What is your experience when you go to a Pride Parade today with millions of people in the street? What do you feel?
Well, one of the things I remember is that when we started Somos, there was we once had an idea. Let's spend a weekend together. Let's all spend all of us stay in one place and discuss politics and make love to each other and everything together. And we couldn't find anywhere to take us. It was very difficult to find places to meet. We weren't accepted anywhere. And in this case, we ended up going to my parents had a house in a holiday place, and we had this meeting there. And then when I see the thousands and thousands of people all sort of parading and wearing all sort of fancy costumes, and I couldn't help feeling, thinking about how things have changed, from that point of view. However, from this point of view, as I was saying, the excitement of the time, when we were living as awful military dictatorship, which was awful, but probably it was worse than what we're going through now at the moment. But the feeling one has under Bolsonaro, is very, very similar in a way. I think, it's Bolsonaro and his regime and his, terribly backward, terribly repressive, awful. And then, but although we have much more freedom now, there isn't this excitement. There's this excitement, everyone going out and parading and so on, but not for really political organization. I feel this is, probably, much more is happening today than was at the time. As I say, things were, everything was much smaller at the time. But I feel at the time, one felt that things were going to change. There was a great, not only in Brazil, but all over the world. There was the right wing kept sort of raising this boogeyman of communism, and the communists were going to be taking over the world, and so on and so on. And that served, on one hand, as a way of scaring people, but on another hand way as also a hope, so that it seemed as if there was this possibility at the time of great sort of radical change, sort of in a very short while. And nowadays, one feels that at best, one's going to get rid of Bolsonaro and some of his close cronies. But I don't think many people expect a sort of radical, even if Lula becomes president and so on, he's going to have a great difficulty in reverting some of Bolsonaro's worst measures. And I have lots of criticisms of Dilma, but I don't think we're even going to get close to what was like under Dilma, because there's now this independence of the central bank, and Petrobras has been sort of weakened terrifically, and Eletrobras has been privatized. So it's going to be very difficult for Lula to really sort of exert, make sort of great changes in Brazil, unless he has a very, very wide support from deputies and so on, which, I don't know. We don't even know for sure that there will be elections, and that if Lula is elected, he will take power, and so on. So it's
uncertainty ahead.
I'm now much older as well, but at the time I felt much more hopeful and optimistic than I am at the moment for great changes happening.
Edward, when I was doing research for Beyond Carnival, I discovered that the people who came out and had their youth and their vibrant life in the 50s consider that the golden age. People in the 60s, that was the golden age. People in the 70s, the golden age. I think when you're young, the world is it. Exactly. Just one last question I wanted to ask you. If you recall, in the 2018 elections, when Bolsonaro ran against Fernando Haddad, the former mayor of the city of São Paulo and the former minister of education, one of the tactics used by the Bolsonaro campaign was to circulate materials criticizing Haddad for allegedly supporting gay rights and even promoting homosexuality within the school system. It seems likely that during the campaign this year, the same homophobic criticisms of the gay movement, the use of this term, the ideology of gender, which is basically an attack on trans people and their desire to question gender roles and allow the society to kind of be more fluid about gender. How do you see that playing out, and what is going to be the long-term legacy of these right-wing ideas, which are really at the core against the thrust, the ideas of the LGBTQIA plus movement since its inception in 1978?
Well, I think when they talk about gender ideology, this horrible expression invented by the Catholic Church, in fact.
Right.
Originally, it was something devised to discriminate against feminism, against the challenges that the women were making to sort of traditional gender roles. Then now, that this is another. This is something I haven't studied closely, but which I experience as is this whole trans movement. This was something that didn't exist when we began. There was one person who was sort of trans or something, and who was rather ridiculed, in fact, by the gays, and didn't receive much support from the women either. I don't know if you remember her. It was she was known as Betania, remember? And anyway, there was something which wasn't really discussed. Nowadays, I see it at the university, among my friends, or among the younger part of my friends, people who are students of mine. I have a nephew who is sort of non-binary, and this has really become a big thing now. And you do see people. Brazil is much freer in ways of behavior, of dressing, and so on than it was 40 years ago or so. These gender roles have been questioned to a large extent. You still have very traditional groups, but this questioning of traditional gender roles has become quite extensive, and going as far as a lot of attention being given to the trans people. It's not only male and female gender roles, but also trans, and the lots of singers, performers who develop their whole work around these trans questions. This has become sort of almost mainstream culture almost in Brazil now. So I think that in spite of Bolsonaro and his cronies' sort of efforts to revive all these prejudices and so on, there will be a great opposition and questioning of this. I think even in these last few years, even since 2018, things have moved in Brazil. And it's a different political situation. I think Bolsonaro and the extreme right have shown themselves to be incompetent and to be absurd in so many ways that large amounts of people will be questioning these positions they might bring.
Any last thoughts before we conclude today? Any last comments or message you'd like to give to the public?
Well, I think there has been a revisiting of the sort of whole 60s culture. I see among my students, the younger students, they are interested in this book of mine, and for the things that I discuss about the more sort of cultural questionings, and the drug question has become, much more visible. But at the same time, Brazilians have always been very, very suspicious of politicians, including left-wing politicians. And I think this continues. And I think that is where Bolsonaro will be more effective, actually, with this sort of raising the specter of communism, which is, Brazil's never been there's never been had much communism around Brazil, and there's never been much of a threat of communism in Brazil, and much less now. But there are a whole lot of people who seem to believe that Lula is going to bring communism around.
And they're all going to flee to Miami and to ask for political asylum. Yeah.
Yeah.
Listen, Edward, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure remembering the past, thinking about the present, and being hopeful about the future. Thank you so much for joining me.
I'm hopeful.
I hope that you enjoyed the interview. If you are watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.